There we go. Okay, thank you everybody for coming today to our Adequate Housing and Fair Rents, an insight from private renters in Wales. So this is going to be the launch of our most recent Tenant Pulse report. Today we have in attendance a mixture of policymakers, tenants and landlords, and some of the tenants in attendance today did contribute to the findings, so we want to take this opportunity to thank you for doing so and to thank all the other tenants for their involvement. And we also would like to thank Pobble, as they are our sponsor for Tenant Pulse. As I'm sure many of you on this call are aware, the reality of the housing crisis has never been more apparent than it is now. A number of organisations have called for the right to adequate housing, and because in many countries housing is a fundamental human right and it's incorporated in legislation. In the cooperation agreement between Welsh Government and Plaid Cymru, there was a commitment to publish a white paper on the proposals to introduce the same right in Wales, the right to adequate housing. So this Tenant Pulse is a result of the Welsh Government's recent publication of the Green Paper on fair rents and affordability. Your hosts today are...
Yes.
Me, Elizabeth Taylor, the policy lead at TPAS Cymru, and David Wilson.
So some of you will know us already. As I say, we normally lead on Pulse type activities, and yeah, we'll be answering any questions today for those who aren't familiar with us. Yeah. So Tenant Pulse, as we're going to run through now a little bit about what the report is. This report will be available in the next few days. If you need it in advance, just put your name or contact us in the chat. You can do that privately as well in the private chat, and we'll send it to you as soon as today, but we'll publish it formally this week. Yeah, so what is Tenant Pulse? If you're not familiar, it's a national platform that we developed in consultation with Welsh Government, who part fund us. And it enables tenants and renters to give their views on different subjects. This one was private renter. There's one live at the moment for social housing. Some of them are mixed as well, because we'd like to get those comparisons between social and private renters, see where the common themes are as well. So we do a number of them over the year, annual surveys, topical ones, and like I say, specific audiences like this. We have a number of tenants who have said, could you send us them? But we also have other ways we promote it. So just and so you'll often see there's often live surveys open. We've got some interesting ones around, getting tenants' views on net zero. There's an interesting one about references at the moment on our Pulse portal. So yeah, always good on. So this one, how do we promote it? As I said already, we sent it to private renters who'd already signed up on our Pulse all across Wales. We promote it on social media, as you would expect. Usual channels like Facebook, Instagram, and some newer ones like Mastodon we're finding interesting. And also, I think most importantly, the single parents' well-being. This was initiated by Elizabeth, and I think it was because we wanted to get their views. It was a really important. We'll come on to more about that in a bit, but we partnered with the single parents' well-being to capture their important views. We also did some small paid adverts on Instagram to reach younger, non-engaged renters. We didn't have much budget for this, and this is something we need to talk to Welsh Government, I think, going forward, because we could have got much more responses, but we didn't have a budget necessarily allocated for this. And so I think that did hamper some of it. But again, we know it works. We've got channels that we can use. We're always trying different things to reach younger, non-engaged tenants.
Okay, so what we're going to look at throughout this webinar is the background and the reason that we carried out this pulse in the first place, the methodology that we used, the findings and our recommendations. There will be an opportunity at the end for you to ask any questions. You can ask, as we said, in the Q&A or comments, and we'll give you the opportunity to speak if you wish to do so. So the background of this, as we said, this is a result of the Welsh Government publishing their Green Paper on fair rents and affordability. So that's when we took the opportunity to collaborate with Single Parents Wellbeing Charity and try and gain that insight from the private renters who are single parents and understand their challenges and hopes and aspirations for the future of renting privately in Wales, really, and to explore private renters' views on the green paper and what was being proposed.
I think also it's just interesting that we wanted to get an angle that was different to other people, because we knew housing adequacy, there's plenty of people, multiple organisations considering that, commenting on that. We knew Welsh Government were running their own events with landlords and tenants. I don't think that worked out as well as they maybe had hoped for some of the tenant responses. So I'm really glad that we ran this tenant survey in partnership with single parents.
Yeah, we wanted to really make sure that we got representation from tenants as much as possible, really, because it's so hard to reach the private rental sector tenants. And as we know, there's not much data out there. So our reports really draws on that data from renters who are living in the private sector across all 22 local authority areas in Wales. And as I said, with that significant lack of data in the private sector, we really hope that this will help to support those policy developments and the reform of housing that's being done lots recently. So this report sets out the basis really for our green paper consultation response. We won't be doing a seminar or webinar on our consultation response per se, but we have got this session today, and we'll base our response, the consultation response, solely on the views of tenants to ensure that the tenant voice has been heard at national policy level. And because, as David said, you know, there are plenty of people doing the work in housing adequacy, and we're certainly not experts in rent controls. This is just the views of tenants. Our report was carried out through using mixed methods. So we use qualitative and quantitative approaches. We did this under the joint branding of TPAS Cymru and Single Parents Wellbeing, using our new Pulse platform, which is Question Pro, which is an online survey tool, which is quite good actually. Now we're learning how to use it better. And we shared 17 questions to the private renters, and that was done in July 2023. So we asked tenants what fair rents meant to them, what they value when it comes to renting their home, and the analysis included characteristics of the private renters, including gender, age, and whether people identified as a single parent specifically, because this was obviously partnered with Single Parents Wellbeing. And we also carried out an online focus group with single parents from across South, Mid and North Wales.
So as you we had to say 312 private rent responses. This was quite a short window because of the green paper, and I'd like to have, we'd had a bit more budget, we could have done a bit more, but I was quite pleased with that response. It gave us enough data to get some good themes. As you can see, the 22 local authorities are all represented. There is a Cardiff bias. I think there's two things to that. One is Cardiff has a lot of private renters compared to maybe some of the other areas of Wales. There's also an element of the demographics of the single parent network as well, although they're pan Wales. But yeah, I think PRS, we generally do find there's a much bigger Cardiff response compared to other parts of Wales. And I think, so when we first start looking at the housing adequacy, you know, what does that mean to people? So there's 7 principles as set out by the UN. And you can see there that there was a number of, you know, things like affordability is clearly going to come out strong. You know, it's a fundamental right, fundamental need, should we say. There is something there about people understanding the terms, you know, so, you know, security of tenure, you know, is fine. Some of these things like availability of services, materials, facilities and infrastructure, you know, it does get a bit lost on people as to what that is. Cultural inadequacy as well, really important, fundamental, but again, it didn't really get that response from tenants. And I know, you know, they're interlinked. These 7 principles actually aren't in isolation, but we just wanted to see that tenant's view on what was the most important to them. And as I say, oh, the blue's slightly cut off there, isn't it, Elizabeth? In the view, but yeah, as you'd imagine, affordability, security of tenure, real fundamentals there.
Yeah, almost half of them chose affordability. Because we asked them out of the 7 criteria, which do they value the most? So really, you know, we appreciate that that may undermine those other factors that we've asked them to say which one was the most important to them. But, you know, it was expected that affordability was going to come out based on the current climate.
Yeah.
As we said at first glance, affordability 48% and security of tenure 31% was the most important to private renters.
Yeah.
Habitability followed this at 15%, and the findings were in line with the expectations based on that current cost of living crisis, as I mentioned, and other previous research carried out by Benham Foundation, JRF, etc. Noticeably, the seventh factor on cultural inadequacy that David mentioned was not identified as the most valuable by any of the respondents, which may be because of only enabling the one respondents to choose one options, and potentially the lack of understanding the term. People had mentioned, what does this mean? So I think it's really important to note that we're asking people to explain how they feel about it before they understand it. Almost 60% of single parents valued affordability as a key factor to housing adequacy, so a higher range. When we looked at age variation of the respondents, there was a noticeable difference between age groups, and age factors. So renters aged between 18 to 24 valued habitability and affordability as equally important, 40% each, followed by security of tenure, which was only 10% for that age group, and availability of services, again, only 10%. The three remaining factors were not deemed as valuable or to that age group, or lack of understanding. The age group that felt affordability was the most significant was those aged between 25 and 34, with 63%, and those aged 54 to 64, 66%, which deemed security of tenure as their main value. So it was varied on age, which was quite interesting, and this was quite consistent throughout the whole report. There's huge variations on age groups. There was also, when we looked at gender variation, there was a variation of preference based on the gender. So women considered affordability more important than men did, and men deemed security of tenure and habitability as more important, and non-binary respondents felt affordability was the most important factor as well. So what do tenants believe we need to improve, and what we need to do to improve housing adequacy? David?
So there was a couple of obviously big themes here, and I don't think there'd be massive surprises to you in terms of obviously affordability and realistic rents, fundamental there, isn't it? Implementation of rent caps. Even before we went on to the questions around some of Welsh governments in the paper talked about rent controls and stuff, there was a feeling that it was just out of control, that they felt helpless. We'll see some case studies in a second, and again, notice period, that I know a lot of work's gone on, but maybe that hasn't filtered through yet in that tenancy notice period. We're not maybe seeing the benefits yet. Maintenance, as you'd expect, and bedroom tax reform, it's still hurting people out there. Maybe there's, because we were partnered with the single parent network as well, it came up a lot in questions, didn't it? So yep. Maybe we move on to some of the, I think some of the work better. Yeah. So
first one was the most consistent throughout, as expected. Affordability and realistic rents. One tenant said that local housing allowance needs to be raised to meet the growing rent increases. My rent increased from £780 to £1,000 last October, and I've been told it will be increasing again soon. I have no car, and the way myself and my child live is awful. No activities other than paying bills at present, no cinema, meals out, visiting family has decreased due to transport costs. We no longer feel like part of the world. Living costs are really taking their toll. So there's a clear call for rents to stop increasing at the same pace as market rates, whilst local housing allowance has stayed the same since 2020, leaving a significant shortfall for eligible families. Families who aren't eligible for welfare support are also feeling the impact of the rent increases, leading to fears of losing their homes and having to cut back on all other expenses.
And I know this is just an example from the focus group, but that's a good 20-odd% increase, and that type of impact when you're not getting an improvement in LHA rates, things like that, is crippling at the moment.
Yeah, and there are more examples within the report. That's just one example. So implementation of rent caps. So consistent with the emphasis on bringing local housing allowance rates to meet the level of private rents, respondents suggested bringing in some form of rent cap, one in which landlords are not able to make substantial gain from their tenants, capital gain. So one tenant said there needs to be a limit on how much the rent cap goes up each year to ensure I can afford to live and provide for my family. Putting a roof over our heads in the area that I have family support should not mean that I can't afford to feed them and I am having to use food banks. It just can't carry on like this. As I mentioned earlier, this is the information that we will share in our consultation response. And TPAS Cymru do support the measure to stabilise those rent costs, but we believe that there is much more research needed to be carried out to understand the various rent control models before introducing them here in Wales. And we are really, really conscious that such policy interventions are not a long-term solution for what is the root problem, which is the lack of social housing in Wales. Just a caveat right there. So the next point, increasing the length of tenancy and the notice period. So despite the implementation of the Rent in Homes Act in December 2022, renters in the private sector are still feeling incredibly vulnerable to eviction and really feeling that lack of and sense of security. Really like that sense of security, sorry. So one tenant said, "This is our home. If we are paying rent and behaving appropriately, we should be given at least 1 year's notice to leave. Given how hard it is to find suitable properties to ensure children can stay in the same school with their friends, etc." Again, this is just one point that was raised. There are many more within the report, but people are really feeling the pinch. They're feeling like they've got no security within their homes. Landlords, because of potentially because of the reform, people are selling their properties or moving back in, etc. Then two more, sorry, property maintenance. There was a clear frustration amongst respondents, which is always the case in social and private, about property maintenance, so the upkeep of their homes. And some felt that there were opportunities to increase the quality of their home to minimise other outgoings, EPC ratings, etc. Whilst others felt that they were paying high rents, yet the standard of the property was not sufficient and they had no other options. One said, "Well, our house is full of damp, but but if we make too much fuss about it, we will end up losing our tenancy. And as it was so difficult to even find this house, I would be homeless with my children. Tenants have no rights in real terms, no matter what it says on paper. Our house is full of damp and mould and the rent just went up. I get told to clean it anyway." Now, bedroom tax reform. So another welfare reform issue, which isn't obviously, as probably many of us on this call know, a devolved policy area in Wales. But I think it's important that we start sharing this information, as it's been clear for us during this survey that people don't really know about devolution. People don't know that housing is a devolved area, and so is education, and that welfare is not, probably because it may not make sense to many. So people were saying that reform policy, which only allows me to claim for 2-bedroom house despite having 2 children. They are 2 and 12 and both boys are expected to share, and it's an unreasonable expectation. And the reason we put 2 quotes in here is because there were so many of similar quotes throughout. Reform benefits policy which expects 2 children of the same sex to share a bedroom despite being vastly different in ages. So there's obviously a consistent theme there. That being said, about tenants being aware of where the responsibility falls, this is a significant issue for tenants. So potentially, for us, or maybe the Single Parents Wellbeing Charity, they're going to be looking at how they can do a campaign around amending the age of sharing a bedroom rather than eliminating bedroom tax.
So in that first example, 2 and 12, then you're suddenly getting into 4, 14, 5 and 17. It's that's a challenging type of thing.
For tenants, it's obviously through this report, we've seen that that's a real issue. Moving on to fair rents. So what do fair rents mean to private renters? As expected, throughout the consistent theme throughout this report, is that it's affordable. So just to know, the renters could choose up to 3 options during this question, which is why the labels exceed 100%. So to understand what was most important to the renters, we asked them to identify factors that they deemed or they defined as fair regarding rents. And as expected from previous questions, the highest was almost 88% with affordability. Restrictions on the frequency and size of rent rises came in a close second, and no hidden charges as a third. So all money related, all outgoings related. Clearly, the direct cost implication to the renter is the most significant factor when defining fair. Interestingly, there were no significant differences in single parent households or genders in terms of the factors needed to deem rents as fair. They were consistent throughout.
Sorry, Liz, can I just make one comment on there?
Yeah.
Quite a disappointingly high figure there about no hidden charges. And I think we've discussed this looking at some of the examples and the commentary that was in the survey around there's still evidence of some interesting practice around charges, despite, you know, the reforms we've had, you know, the changes in what is
Renting Homes Fees Act.
Rented Homes Act, yeah, you know, and I think there's still a lot of things. We have some case studies at the moment on the go, don't we, Elizabeth? You know, where we're still quite shocked at. It's more smaller landlords rather than the letting agents, but things that just really aren't, you know, and even legal, you know. So that figure was a little bit higher and surprised me a bit.
There was the question then from tenants around who's monitoring the Renting Homes Fees Act, who's monitoring that tenants aren't being charged that additional cost.
Yeah.
So this one came up, which we thought was quite interesting. How the chart lands is they wanted more choices for the same price. So the age range varied, as you can see. Affordability was equal for all age groups. However, this choice of having a range of choices for the same price was less important the older the tenant got. So 18 to 24 and 24 to 34 felt that was incredibly important. But then those, as they got older, they weren't as bothered if there was any more choices. It was more about affordability.
And security, yeah.
Focus group findings. So the first finding in setting fair rents was rents were set around minimum wage. So this was a common consensus amongst the focus group respondents. They felt that setting a rent based on the average earnings in that area would stop people on lower income being able to afford certain areas, which would consequently lead to those societal divides that we don't want. Finding 2 was all housing costs considered to determine what fair rent would actually mean. So they felt that all costs relating to the housing expenses should be considered. So, you know, utilities, gas, electric, insurances, etc. They said that it was expected that rent would be the highest outgoing, but not an outgoing that stops them being able to afford all their other outgoings. So all respondents within the group emphasised that their rents increased significantly, as we know, but their income has not. They spoke of the sacrifice that they were having to make as a consequence of their increased rent, such as not putting the heating on in the winter, using food pantries and moving in with parents, getting rid of cars, not being able to eat. David?
Yeah, so this 2 interesting ones here that I suppose I didn't really expect initially was when we talked about what was fair, and we'd obviously had a section beforehand about the different United Nations rights to what is adequate housing. The tenants themselves, the renters themselves, felt that there should be a difference between smaller landlords and bigger landlords in terms of their responsibilities and in terms of providing adequate housing. And they very much saw that somebody who had a smaller, you know, maybe 1 property, accidental landlords, you know, 1, 2 properties, shouldn't have to provide all 7 factors of adequacy, compared to somebody who has a larger portfolio who should have more, they felt should have more responsibility to provide these 7 factors. So there was an interesting concept that they very much saw there, as a differentiating different landlords. And this next bit came up a lot, both in the survey and in the focus groups, but it was about who is monitoring, who is regulating the private rental sector. Now, we know that's part of Rent Smart Wales, but I think there was a feeling of, is that enough? Is it working? Is there more independent voice to go to? Is there other places? The conversation kept using the word things like Ofsted and Estin, like schools that are inspected. Why aren't landlords inspected? Why aren't they
Yeah,
given a
and the
review
letting
on? Yeah.
agents, that came up
Yeah.
a lot. So amongst all the respondents, they'd all rented through a letting agent, and they felt that stronger monitoring of agents would lead to better outcomes for both the tenant and the landlord. And
And I know
again,
they've got professional bodies, but it was that independent assessment of agents, you know, like you would have a school inspection. It came up a lot. And I think, do you want to mention the housing options model in Cardiff?
yeah,
We
so
did this quite a bit, didn't we?
yeah, so the other factor within that finding four was, first one, monitoring of letting agents. Second one was the housing option model. So in Cardiff, the council offers that housing advice and assistance for people who are at risk of homelessness. And as it offers that support element, the financial support element, but it also offers an inspection process. And when they help a renter to find a property, they assess the whole property to determine the suitability of it. Just much like when we buy a house, the surveyor comes in to check the property. The respondents in the focus group felt that this should be an option for anyone considering renting, and that either the estate agents become trained to ensure the properties are adequate, or an independent advisor attends the property during the
I think they were
person.
expecting more from the letting agent, weren't they, in terms of
Yeah, they felt
standards,
that there should be someone
saying, no, this
potentially
property is not fit for standard and things like that. I think
someone who potentially is independently funded to be in the letting agent to go and check the properties. This is the language they were using. And so one of them said that when she went to get a property, they measured the distance between the banister of the stairs to check that their child couldn't fall through. Obviously, this is a big ask, and it's a huge requirement for every property to be checked. But I think in the first instance, maybe it's to look at those disadvantaged groups having something like this, not just those who are disadvantaged due to becoming homeless, but other disadvantaged groups as well. Then we asked, do tenants think that 30% of household income is an appropriate indicator for affordability? Again, as many of us on this call know, the 30% median of a median income is deemed as affordable. At a first glance, yes, tenants agreed. Almost 65% of respondents agreed that it is 30% is a fair measurement, and there were no significant differences when it came to those single parents households and those identifying as female. However, 72% of men felt that 30% was an appropriate indicator of affordability. So this is probably the only gender variation coming out throughout the study. When exploring age variation, the only noticeable difference was in those aged 55 to 64, with 74% of this age group deeming 30% as an appropriate indicator of affordability. I know you're wondering, why don't the other 35% of tenants think that it's an appropriate indicator of affordability? There are two reasons why. The first reason was that the current cost of living crisis makes 30% of rent unaffordable. So this theme was most reoccurrent amongst the data. And whilst there are different suggestions around more appropriate percentages, the reality of the cost of living crisis couldn't be more distinguished throughout. Respondents felt that the increase in all other costs meant that 30% was no longer attainable, and that considerations relating to council tax, utilities, energy bills should all be factored into setting affordable rents. The second finding was that it led to setting one affordability percentage led to an unfair bias. And again, this was really consistent throughout, with some respondents feeling that the bias was towards people on lower incomes and others towards those on higher incomes. So there was a real mix of what people were saying. The data suggests that one size fits all approach would have unintended consequences on renters.
So
Now, rent controls.
we wanted to do this because we felt other people would. So the green paper talked about a number of different rent models. I think there was 7, wasn't there, in the green paper, and we felt we wanted to ask tenants about it. You know, I know they're complicated subjects, these different models of rent control, but the fact is, there was a green paper asking for people's views on it, and we knew landlords and stuff would be responding on that, so we wanted to talk to tenants about it, give them a little bit of an overview, and see what they felt about them. Again, I know they're complex subjects, but everyone has a right to a view on this. So we test it with people, and just move on. Sorry, Elizabeth's got the controls. And we asked, you know, if Wales were to adopt a rent control model, which would you support? And actually, 8 options there, sorry, my fault. There was also the option of no rent control as well. So, and we asked her, and we actually had a fairly equal spread amongst the 8 options, and barely anything registering for no rent controls. Tenants were in a huge majority wanting some forms of rent controls because they felt it was out of control. As I say, they were very split on that. So the top 3 options were a temporary rent freeze in terms of economic crisis. Feel like that could be right now. Rent increases are linked to landlord improving the energy efficiency of the property. Certainly for me, somebody who's working in net zero, I was pleased to see that they saw that relationship between if the landlord improved the energy efficiency of the property and made it cheaper for them to live in, then there's more accommodation for rent increases. And again, the support for specific local rent controls in high pressure areas. How that's defined, that's another day, but those were the top 3 options. And the least popular, as I say, apart from no rent control, which was barely registering, was rents reset around local market rates for new tenancies based on government data. I think they just didn't quite understand what all that meant. And we have to accept that, you know, it could have been actually a perfect model, but if you don't have that understanding of it. So did gender or single parent make a difference? No, not really. Not for being a single parent or particular gender stuff. We felt that there were no significant differences on those factors. However, there were some. Age made a big difference. So the youngest bracket, you know, was 18 to 25, were the least in favour of rent being linked to energy efficiency. Maybe they haven't paid the bills long enough. And whereas as you got older, it was in contrast, you know, it was the top preference by quite a bit for those 65 plus. And say it got that preference grew as people got older. And so I think there's a policy thing there about, you know, if there is something about exploring rent rises, linking it to energy efficiency improvements as we look at decarbonisation, but it's another day. And also, you know, did age make a difference as well on other things? Yeah. So the overall preferred option, temporary freezes in times of crisis. Remember, that was the top one. It was driven by younger people. You know, as they got older, that preference started to die away a bit, and there was more in favour of specific local rent controls, in more targeted rent controls rather than freezes for everybody in terms of crisis. So you could see that slight subtlety, I think, as people got older.
And I think, again, it was just, there was a clear, almost lack of understanding of what each rent control meant specifically. And just the main thing was people needed some help. Like affordability was so important. It was so key to everybody that was rent freeze was going to be what people were going to choose.
In the report, there's more graphs and things like that. I just felt it was a bit of a chaotic graph, so I felt it wasn't suitable for this webinar today. But no, they support the principle of it. They support a number of models depending on age and things. And I think they were keen to see what, you know, where this went.
What each went, yeah, what was meant by each one. Yeah. So, recommendations. In line with the recent JRF briefing, we support the following recommendation based on the findings within this report. So, as an immediate priority, the UK government should unfreeze local housing allowance and at a minimum realign with the 30th percentile of local market rents. Secondly, in line with the NRLA report, we support the following recommendation based on the findings within this report, and that is Welsh Government must commit to the establishment and maintenance of a Welsh housing survey and undertake a comprehensive assessment of the private rented sector before introducing further legislative changes. So whilst we appreciate that this is a small insight into the tenants' views in Wales, there is much more data needed to understand it as a whole so we can see what the future of the PRS looks like. We have also recently received Shelter's green paper, who have called for no-fault evictions in the PRS, and we will be adding that into our green paper too, supporting that. Our recommendation for the report is landlords, agents and policymakers must consider the impact and noticeable differences based on age ranges.
It's a very different different needs at different parts of your life.
How that's done, we couldn't say, but definitely something that needs to be considered. Welsh Government should consider the implementation of a stronger independent body building on Rent Smart Wales to monitor, inspect and investigate agents and landlords within the private sector. Landlords, agents and policymakers must consider that single parents are immediately at a disadvantage when it comes to renting a property and must be considered when setting fair rents. Welsh Government must prioritise the negative financial implications of rent rises on low earnings alongside the cost of living crisis on private renters in Wales. And the Welsh Government must develop a clear housing strategy for Wales, which visibly outlines the importance of the PRS as well as the expectations and ambitions for it to be fair and equitable. I know Welsh Government are on the call probably thinking, any more for us? And that is it from us. Oh, sorry, we do a prize draw for our tenants who take part in the survey, and these are our winners of the prize draw. Tenants who have asked for a copy of the report will be sent the report. A follow-up user group with Welsh Government, so we'll be discussing this in more depth with Welsh Government. TPAS Cymru will be formally replying to the consultation, and we will be responding based on the tenants' views. And the web page with the report will go live towards the end of this week. But if you do want a copy of the report, please do email us after this and we can send it over. Any questions? I think we've got one question.
Do
you want to answer this one, David?
So Mandy Morris has asked were any questions posed to two groups of private. I don't know about the focus group, Elizabeth, but in the main survey, it wasn't one of the factors, and I did regret that. It's always a fine line as to how many control questions we ask at the beginning, you know, in terms of demographics, things like that, people's backgrounds and things like that. It does make it easier then to filter and pull out more insight, but we didn't do it this time because we haven't seen huge differences on some of the things recently we've been doing. So no, it wasn't one of the factors. Sorry, Mandy, but we've got civic insight in the commentary and things like that when you see the fuller report.
And just to add to that, Single Parents Wales, I don't know if many of you have heard of the charity, but they are also going to be writing a report based solely on the single parent findings, rather than the whole PRS. Does anybody have any other questions?
Quiet crowd today on a Monday morning.
Did anybody find that helpful? Was that webinar okay? It is a lot to info to process. It is
Amanda, yeah. The full report, so there is a summary as well in the 2-pager, Elizabeth, I think. Yeah,
very short summary actually. So it's just, there's always a lot of information to process within the report.
And Rayner's asking if you can ask a question.
Live.
And I think, if I just remember how to do it.
I think I can do it. There we go.
Oh yeah, you've got the controls, yeah.
And you have to unmute yourself, Mel.
Yeah, but I had to find my microphone as well. I know you said that the landlords obviously will be making a different response.
Doesn't mean different. We just know they'll make another response.
Another response. Sorry. Just looking at it from the point of view of landlords, obviously they have certain fixed expenses, especially where it's just a single person who's let their property for whatever reason. Is it not? Would it not be, in some ways, equitable to be able to ask the landlord exactly what their expenses are, and to then base the rent on that?
It's an interesting one, Matt, because I've had this conversation with somebody recently, because sometimes the rent justification for going up is, well, I've got much more expenses and things like that. Yeah, fair enough. But the tenant doesn't have that defense, do they? That they've got more expenses and things, and more cost of the house. I agree. The fact if you're highly leveraged, you've got a lot of debt, on the mortgage property, and that's going up and it's going much more expensive. Is that the tenant's fault? So no, it's an interesting one. And tenants did see the difference, as I said already, between a small landlord and a bigger landlord. And I don't know what that means or how that we can interpret that, but they were just reporting what they said, and they saw a different responsibility for bigger landlords to behave and to do better, if that makes sense.
And just quickly as well, if I can, I think looking for a year's notice of ending a tenancy is very optimistic. I would have thought 3 months was long enough. But,
well, there is.
I'm defending landlords, and I'm not.
No, I know it's not that. It's there is already a year essentially from the through the Renting Homes Act. It's 6 months. After you can't issue a notice until you've been in the property for 6 months, and then you get a 6 month notice period. So there is already 1 year. But I think it's that 6 month notice period. So they might have lived there for 12 years, and then they've only got 6 months to leave then, and they want a year.
Can I just quickly say my experience of the private rented sector was appalling. I went up, my landlord insisted in being paid in cash. I wonder why. And I went out one evening, having lived in the place and paid all my rent up front for about 3 months, and found all my property out on the front garden. Oh. That was my experience.
Right. And that's why we've seen a lot, I'm hoping some improvements, but we're still seeing some bad practice. I mentioned about things like fees, illegal fees. One of the TPAS team was written to by her landlord recently, with some blatantly illegal fees. And it's like, does she know you work for TPAS? Because, you take on a TPAS member, then you take on all of us. So, and we've gone back to that landlord going, this is just illegal. You can't do this. And so we've ended up speaking to Rent Smart Wales about it, who are very interested. And we're still seeing those practices out there. So
also, Rent Smart Wales don't have the capacity, do they, to investigate every single. No. Okay, thank you, Mel.
Can I answer Jennifer's question? She's put about the representation. I actually think I do take some pride in our pulse work. The fact that the age groups, I think we're quite good at getting younger people in the surveys. You look at some surveys out there of tenants and who responds, it's generally an older population. And that's why we use things like Instagram and stuff to try and deliberately target younger. We get a bit more diversity. We actually had this time in non-binary was about 4% of the responses. Now, I don't know what the Wales figures are in the private rental sector for non-binary, but I was quite pleased in some of the demographics. There was a Cardiff bias, I think I mentioned at the beginning, in terms of across Wales. But again,
and there's also the highest population of PRS renters in Cardiff.
Cardiff has a lot of properties, compared to, say, Ynysmôn or something like that, so in terms of private rental sector. So, no, we are doing more and more, trying to work with more diverse groups. The social housing one we got out at the moment, we've got specific groups we've met. We're going to face-to-face events to get some people to fill out, the pulse as well. So we're always.
I'm just wondering if Jennifer, if you work for, do you work for somebody who is able to support us with that? Because we would definitely be keen to have a conversation about how we can increase that representation. Just like everybody in Wales who's trying to increase that social
I think the
demographic.
basic, the age, gender, locations, I think we're getting that right. This was a little bit different with the Cardiff location, but when I look at other pulses we've done, I think we are
improving.
Not bad, yeah, at getting this, yeah.
Can I answer another question in the chat? So Terry Logan has asked, in terms of around rent controls, was additional information provided to renters about how this would work in practice and any potential unintended consequences that would arise? Keen to hear your experience. So no, there wasn't any additional information, because although within the consultation in the consultation document from Welsh Government, there was a lot of information, there is no way on this earth we could have shared that on the survey. It was, parts of it were shared in a focus group. But we're not experts on rent control, and all we can do is share what's shared with us, essentially. So, and unintended consequences were discussed. I think that's why some of the rent controls were not suggested, and many of them were just about the rents freezing for the time being, because people are struggling so significantly. So this is definitely something that, personally, and probably across the policy area, housing policy area, people feel that this is it is two policy priorities, two completely separate things: fair rents and affordability and adequate housing. And it was quite difficult to look into that in more depth with a joint consultation response. So I think we got quite a good insight from tenants based on the size of the consultation.
I think, Kerry, I mean, whether that part goes forward, I think we wanted just to get that initial, what feels like the right thing, because you see that insight in terms of, you know, targeted areas versus general immediate freezes and stuff like that. So I don't know where that's going to go, but we just wanted to get that snapshot of people, because we knew other people would be giving their views on rent controls.
Yeah, and it's difficult, again, with two distinct policy areas. Does anybody else have any questions before we close the session?
There's some good comments down the side here, Mandy and stuff. We'll be looking at these afterwards in terms of anything that needs to go in there.
Amanda, it didn't include specifically as students. No, we didn't measure that.
No, we've always tried to avoid students from Tenant Pulse. The truth is, because I think they're quite unique in terms of what they value.
They need a unique portal, we think.
Yeah, their experience is very different as well. Sometimes it's people are funded as well, so affordability doesn't come to it. We just felt we have done stuff with student bodies before, and I'd like to do more of it. But I think what we're trying to get is that general renter. People live, you know, the families, the single people, you know, and the 0 hours contracts, things like that. That's sort of everyday living, and I think the student market needs to be kept slightly different for that.
Okay, I'm just checking if there's any more.
Yeah, so Ola's just said, I agree. The NUS have been doing their own response, and rightly so. I think what their needs is are just as important, but just different needs. So yeah.
No worries, Alan. Thanks for coming.
So thanks. I'm going to turn the recording